Hello.
Hello, Professor
Well,
Happer.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about yesterday, but we have more to talk about today.
Yes, of course. No, no problem whatsoever. Great to have you on. Thank you. And
Well,
do you, shall I call you Professor Happer, or shall I call you William, or what do
most
you?
people call me Will.
Will?
Will is, um,
Well, thank you for being here. Yeah, let's just jump right into it. Of course, I sent you some notes yesterday, um, so we
okay.
already the kind of an angle or direction to depart from. What I'm First off, what I'm very interested about is what is it like to be a director of this Department of Energy at the time, or to be a member of a National Security Council? What is it like to be advising White House administrations?
Well, it's in many ways very frustrating because there are many people giving contradictory advice, and so trying to get the right thing done is you're sometimes not successful, but you're talking to people who have a lot of power and you're trying to persuade them to do what you think is the right thing for them to do. And sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't.
Right. And did you get the impression from your time there, and as of course a U.S. citizen and an intelligent human being in general, that beneath the surface of these democratic processes and political hand clap business on the surface, that there are more pervasive, more corrupt, more enduring forces that are pulling levers or controlling directions than just this superficial political process that you see unfolding before you?
Well, we've always worried about the bureaucracy in the United States. One of the accusations against King George III when we declared independence was that he had established this huge bureaucracy that was eating out the substance of the hardworking, honest American citizens. And so we've always been worried about that. It's a common problem in every country, I think, from China to Europe to India, and certainly the United States. So bureaucracies do some good things. For example, they mail your social security check regularly every month, and it gets there into your bank account. They do a good job on that, and they deliver the mail properly. That they do a good job on that. But there are other things that they do that really are harmful. They get in the way of a productive society, and there's a fundamental reason for that, at least in the United States. The way we reward people in the bureaucracy, in the civil service, is that your salary depends on how many people you supervise. So it doesn't matter whether you have talent, or you're a good engineer, or a good accountant. It really only depends whether you have 10 people working with you or 50 people, and your salary goes up accordingly. So the incentives are to bloat the bureaucracy. So if you want to get a raise, you have to hire more people. And to hire more people, you have to have something to do. So you invent, threats. And EPA has been particularly bad about that. Everybody wants a clean environment. And, I don't have any problem with the Environmental Protection Agency, but when they reach victory, they should say we've succeeded and now we'll keep the environment clean. We're not going to invent, imaginary environmental threats, which is what they've done,
Right.
now for 20 or 30 years. So everybody recognizes that, it's not brain dead. And so one thing that could help would be to reform the reward structure so that you reward competent people. You have to figure out how you determine who's competent. That's not trivial, but you could do it and change the incentive to bloat the bureaucracy. And so I mean, that may not be the same problem in all other countries, but it's certainly a problem in the United States.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was wondering while you were talking, of course, the United States are the, let's say, the libertarian experiment of the modern Western world, of course, in a sense, or an experiment of multiculturalism, but especially an experiment of very liberal modes of being, especially compared to the old world, so to speak. So I was wondering, are the United States as of this moment probably equally as bureaucratic as, for example, most of Western European countries, or even more so, or perhaps are Americans more, by their cultural nature, allergic to impediment on freedom, so to speak? I was wondering, what is your impression of the current state of bureaucracy in the United States as compared to?
Well, yeah, we certainly have a bureaucracy, but I don't think it's nearly as pervasive as it is in Western Europe. Or, I was a kid in India. India has an even worse bureaucracy than most countries. They're not bad people, but they gum up the works. And one of the good things the current leadership in India has done is it's repressed the bureaucracies so they do useful things instead of harmful things.
Right.
But I think we've been blessed so far with a smaller bureaucracy than most countries.
Yes. And do you think, because you made a little tangent towards of course, the use of a theme like climate change, for example, which you were hinting at, as a vehicle, of course, of societal collective fears or hysteria or certain psychological processes. Let me allow me to indulge a little bit to fill in the blanks here. That I tend to sense a certain abuse of collective psychological processes via, for example, a threat, real or imaginary, for example, climate change. And before that, of course, in the United States, it was terrorism after 9/11. And probably if we go a little further back in time, it would be Cold War or nuclear threat, or we could go as far back as we want. And of course, all these individual threats, perchance, will differ in terms of how real they are or how substantive they are. But I personally get the sense, especially with climate change, with COVID recently, that the threats that are being held in front of us, like bananas on a string, are becoming more generic and more abstract and more unavoidable. For example, viral disease or the weather, climate, are of course super universal, natural phenomena that are unavoidable to an extent, which to me looks like the imaginary, I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat now for a second, imaginary tinfoil hat, that there is a malignant abuse and a sophistication at that of our fear reflexes as scared human beings, as scared mammals. Would you think I'm a little too cynical there, or do you think there might be some truth to that statement? If we take, for example, climate change or pandemic threats or other recent developments.
Well, I think throughout human history, people have used phony threats, imaginary threats, to do bad things. In our country, one of the first was the Salem witch trials. That was even before we declared independence from Britain. It was 1690 or something like that. And they hung about 20 innocent people, mostly women, but a few men too. And this was it was a hysterical movement, but it was generated by the elite. It wasn't generated by the common people. It wasn't, the basket of deplorables. It was the Harvard-educated judges,
Right.
who, one of whom was making a lot of money selling a book on how to detect witches, That was
Right.
all complete nonsense, and it was driven from the top, by the leadership. And so there are many, many examples of that. You can read about them in the Bible even, it really works. So,
Right.
if you have a lust for power, this is a good way to satisfy it.
And of course, if we take these historical examples like the Salem witch trials or the Spanish Inquisition or
Right,
name it, the Jews poisoned the wells, or
right.
these were always instigations about or allegations about certain people having hidden agendas or being saboteurs, for example, Jews poisoning the wells or women secretly practicing witchcraft and inviting Satan into the village, or converts, Protestant or Jewish or other converts in Spain not being really Christians and having to be persecuted, therefore. But the anchoring of this totalitarian fear towards a certain subject to create this atmosphere of distrust and fear, which is, of course, very controllable by a malignant dictatorial or tyrannical force, was always rooted in some kind of suspicion of a certain stratum of people. Whereas nowadays, that mechanism is still the same, but now we, for example, you and I, would be traitors to science or traitors to the planet, to good Mother Earth.
Hmm.
So it's not like, I'm not Jewish, but did I poison the well or not? Or did I made a pentagram in my living room and try to summon the goat spirit secretly in my backyard? Now it is, you are disobeying what they claim to be a universally accepted scientific narrative, which will lead the big apocalypse to come forward without unimpeded. So it is the same mechanism, but they use something like CO2 is an unavoidable thing. It's a provable thing. It's a real thing. Carbon dioxide is real. We have the problems here in the Netherlands and in Germany with these farmers that are being put in a very tough corner because of nitrogen. There's this allegation that too much nitrogen coming from manure and stuff has a bad effect on nature. I'm not a biologist or a zoologist, so I don't know, but I do know, and I do recognize from my cynical brain does recognize this pattern recognition thing where CO2, nitrogen, flu-like viruses are unavoidable, but the threat of poisoning of the environment, the threat of pandemic, the threat of starvation, of other subsequent, these are very deep instinctual drives, of course. Um,
Look, you've touched on two of the key elements of life. You and I are made of carbon and nitrogen, and life is made of carbon and nitrogen. There are a few other elements, a lot of hydrogen and oxygen too. But you can't have life without those, and nitrogen is often in very short supply because it normally is in the molecule, diatomic nitrogen in the atmosphere, and that's the most strongly bound molecule you will find. It's very hard to break that apart and use it to make life. And so nitrogen has been in short supply since life evolved. Some organisms have learned how to break apart that molecule, and we've learned also how to make useful nitrogen fertilizer synthetically. The Bosch-Haber process, for example, was a tremendous boon to mankind. It wasn't invented for fertilizer, it was invented for explosives. But it's been a tremendous boon to farmers everywhere. Nitrogen has always been in the earth. My country and the United States, we had millions of buffaloes roaming, the prairies before the Europeans wiped them out. It was really a tragic thing. But they were all producing nitrogen from their manure. They all were producing methane from eating grass. You can't grow if you're a cow and eat grass unless you emit methane. You have to do that.
right.
And so it's crazy. but most people don't know any science. So these sort of quasi-science things are easy to use as tools to frighten people. And that's certainly something I noticed when I was in the government, both in Department of Energy and in the White House, that most politicians weren't very good at science anyway. When they were in school, they made bad grades and they hated mathematics. And so if you give them a simple argument, say, look, 2 + 2 is really only 4, it's not 7. They think, what are you trying to confuse me? The IPCC has told me that it's 2 + 2 is 7. How could all those people be wrong? And you say, well, look, you can just count on your fingers, 2 + 2, it makes 4. But you don't get anywhere with those arguments. So I think the lack of logic in so many people is a big part of our problems. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, wrote these wonderful letters from prison before he was executed by the Nazis. And one of the points he made was that, how was it that Germany, the home of poets and philosophers and musicians, in many ways the most cultured country in Europe, had produced the likes of Hitler and Goebbels and the jackbooted Nazi thugs? How's that possible? And he said he thought the fundamental problem was stupidity. It was not evil so much as stupidity. And so he wrote these long essays on trying to compare the two. And he said of the two, it's much better to fight evil. It's easier to conquer evil than it is to conquer stupidity. And when I first read these essays, I sort of scoffed. But the older I get, the more I think he may have been onto something. He may have been right. Of course, he was hung, before the end of the war. Poor guy. Is a brave man.
Jesus. Perhaps there is a parallel to be made, but with this time, I sometimes tend to feel like we are in a Weimar 2.0 kind of situation, because both the fascist and the communist overtones, I would argue, especially the latter, but also the former, are everywhere. And some of the parables within what we call either woke culture on the left or populist culture on the right, you can see the parallels with the literal histories of Bolshevism and communism in Eastern and Central Europe, as well as the parables with Nazism and fascism in Southern and Western Europe at the time. The parables are staggering. And of course, we see a decline of reason and education. And perhaps that's a nice bridge to make to the institutions that made you as an intellectual and as a person, which you have been a professor and taught. As I wrote to you in my notes, that I'm just appalled to see what is happening now in these universities, where the former left seems to be hijacked in such a manner by subversive idiocy that they are now calling for apartheid and for racism and for anti-Semitism on these campuses, the most exclusive, expensive, and formally high-ranking universities and university campuses on earth are like the Salem witch trials you just mentioned. am I correct? Doesn't that make you grieve a little bit, like the loss of that, the level of integrity?
Well, I see a lot less of it than most because I'm in a science ghetto, and it has not affected us as much. Although we get tremendous pressure too. Why are so many of you white males? And why aren't there some transgender physicists? Are you opposed to them? And but my colleagues in English and history and humanities take the brunt of this. And most of the processors are from these fields. If you're trying to get a degree in physics or chemistry, it's so hard. You really don't have time for this. you have to work on your own research. And if it's a good project, it takes all of your time. It's consuming. And if you're a good student, you like being consumed because you're interested in it.
Right.
But in these other fields, who's going to give you a job if you have a degree in English? Who needs you? Or if you have a degree in sociology, how many sociologists does the world need? So many of these people recognize they're not going to get a job on merits, because they have no value to offer, really. And so they invent, these causes that they're fighting for, justice, when there isn't any injustice to begin with. Right?
Right.
So, I mean, the world's always had parasites like this. They often cloak themselves in false religion, you better serve me, otherwise a wrathful God is going to get you without my help. And I don't have anything against true religion. I mean, some of the greatest motives of mankind have come from true religion, but it's very, very often been distorted. And climate alarmism is just a recent religious cult. It's not very different from the Jim Jones cults in Guyana, where everybody finally had to drink, poisoned Kool-Aid and died of poisoning. And that's essentially what is being demanded of Western civilization. You drink this sustainable Kool-Aid and or else, I think they'll have a harder time doing that in the United States because, we have the Second Amendment, and a very large number of Americans won't do that, and you can't force them to do that because they're armed. Yeah.
And of course, I made acquaintance with you and your work through the recent Climate the Movie documentary,
Uh,
and the reason why I contacted you in the first place is because I'm very interested in the phenomena of subsidy and subsidized departments. I, of course, am from the Netherlands, which is, I would argue, simultaneously one of the most collectivist or socialist countries outside of the communist world in the world, but also at the same time one of the most capitalist countries in the world. We are a very small and densely populated, but also ideologically dense country. And we have a very, very large segment of our society that depends fully on subsidizing. Our arts, for example, where I was trained in, are 100% subsidized, which is a direct relationship with, of course, the government and the taxpayer indirectly. And I've always been interested in this relationship, as it is, of course, a domesticating relationship. It has a certain corrupting relationship. And as your documentary, or the documentary you appeared in, very strongly suggested, this climate research has been like a cancer growth within this governmental departmental structure, which has created a situation where it could expand on itself by virtue of its um, threat, inherent threat signal. And the more subsidy it consumed, the more it had. Sorry, I'm a little tired. I'm trying to find the words in English. This perverting mechanism whereby you can only receive subsidy if you apply in a certain way that reaffirms the status quo. That was what I'm searching for. I see the same thing now, for example, in my field in the arts, in film and theater, where you can only get a play made, for example, if it's a strange conceptual postmodern thing with a lot of black lesbian actresses and a Syrian refugee in it, for example, which creates this very perverse um, monogamous kind of situation where everything becomes like a governmental pamphlet. Everything becomes pamphletic. But the same, I think, as the documentary suggested, Climate the Movie, is happening in a very large sense with this climate narrative and the climate funding and the climate science as a branch per se. Could you comment on that corrupting relationship? And second question, of course, you're at the end of your career, but if you were 19 years old right now and had to start your career right now, do you think the climate as it is, the political climate as it is, might have hindered you or stopped you from pursuing that same career that you have successfully completed?
Well, that's a long and complicated question, but let me try and comment on it. You know, I always wanted to be a physicist. When I was a preschooler, I was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee during World War II, where my mother was working in the Manhattan Project. So I saw lots of physicists and mathematicians and chemists there. And I thought, even as a preschooler, this looks exciting. And I think I'd like to do that if I'm good enough to do it. So I always wanted to do physics. And it never occurred to me that it wasn't a very good way to make a lot of money. I thought I'd make enough that I could learn physics and hopefully contribute. So I think young people today who have that same feeling, who want to do something significant, physics, I think now is not as attractive as it was when I was young, not because of climate science or government. It's just that fields have expansive phases when lots of things are happening, and then there may be a century where nothing happened. Then they explode again with something dramatically new. So that's happened more than once in physics and chemistry and other fields too. So I probably would, you know, choose something a little different, but it would certainly be technical. And I think there are lots of people like that today. I see young people here at Princeton like that, and I admire them. I think they'll have a good career. Climate science itself, though, I first got to know about when I was director of energy research in the early 90s under, you know, George Bush Sr. So I had all of the basic research in the Department of Energy under me, and I thought I should learn what we were spending the money for. It was a bit, even then, it was a pretty big budget. It was $3.5 billion, and $1 billion was worth a lot more in 1990 than it is today. So it was a lot of money. So I'd have people come in from, say, high energy physics and tell me about their search for the top quark, which was exciting at that time. Or we were supporting a lot of work on the human genome because, you know, nuclear physics involves mutations and things like that. So Department of Energy had always been interested in genetics from the time when I was a little kid in Oak Ridge. So people would come in and tell me about the latest gene sequencing machine, and the cost per yeah, base pair was going down, and it was pretty exciting. And but we were also supporting climate science in environment. And when I would ask some principal investigator to come to Washington and brief me and my assistant directors on what they were doing, they would often be reluctant to come, or would say, well, I don't come. I remember one said, well, why are you persecuting me? I said, no, I'm not persecuting you. We just asked someone from high energy to come and tell us what they were doing. They were very pleased to have the opportunity to come to Washington. They said, well, I work for Senator Gore. And I said, well, if you want him to pay you, fine. You negotiate that with him next year, but you know, don't expect your grant to be renewed, you know, by us at Department of Energy. So that usually got their attention, and they would come and give a grudging talk, you know, that was just completely different from any of the other talks. You know, of course, a talk on human genome isn't the same as high energy, but there was a common thread that people were excited in what they were doing. They thought it was important, and but the climate people, they thought of it as they were serving a political cause, and every question you would ask was they would think, is this a political question? Well, if you would ask, say, how do you calibrate this instrument? Are you accusing us of being incompetent? No, of course. You ask everybody, how do you calibrate your instruments? And so I was pretty worried about this part of my portfolio at that time. but you know, I had many things to be busy about, and when Clinton and Gore finally won, Gore couldn't wait to fire me, so he hunted through the bureaucracy and finally caught me and fired me. I was glad to go back to Princeton. My wife was glad to have me back, and I sort of forgot about climate for 5 or 10 years because my lab was still functioning. I was only away for 3 years, and we were doing some exciting stuff, and so I didn't have time to worry about climate. But then I would sit and watch the evening news, and there would be some nonsensical story about the climate apocalypse, which I knew was wrong because I'd funded the research. I knew exactly what the results were. And so I would complain to my wife, and she would say, well, if you're so upset, why don't you start speaking out? You can write articles about it. And so I really owe the encouragement of my wife the situation that I'm in now, where I'm sort of the heretic. And I had many friends at Princeton. Freeman Dyson was a good friend, and he had the same views that I did. And so I didn't feel that I was in bad company. There were other people besides myself whom I respected, who also recognized the nonsense that was being pushed out. So, you know, why do people do this? I don't know. Basic research it's been hard to fund. And so people do try to cast their research as somehow essential to humanity. If you don't fund me next year, you know, something bad is going to happen. And, you know, I don't blame them too much because I used to do that myself when I was a young researcher. And Kepler, you know, the great astronomer who discovered Kepler's laws of planetary motion, he was a real scientist. He was very serious, but he couldn't support himself. And so his real scientific work that we remember him for was a side issue. His real job was the court astrologer, you know, in
Right.
Vienna somewhere. And so the poor guy, you know, he was busy casting horoscopes, which he knew were complete nonsense, but he had to do them anyway to get, you know, the support for his real work. And there was one great letter he wrote that to one of his friends said, the Almighty in his wisdom has given to every beast a means of subsistence, and to the lion he has given claws, and to the astronomer he has given astrology. and so I guess to the climate field, you know, they've been given climate change, you know, like claws to a lion, or that's what the more sincere of them feel. Many of them really are sincere people. They're trying to do something right, but they're afraid to rock the boat. You know, they're afraid that any doubt will cut the funding, and the result has been that many promising directions in climate is important after all. You know, it affects us all. But I think that understanding it has been set back by close to 50 years by this focus on CO2, which is clearly almost irrelevant to climate. It's not a very potent influence compared to things like clouds or the sun and, you know, continental drift. There are all sorts of things that are much more important than CO2. And yet the whole community has been forced to take this seriously. It was like being in the Soviet Union. You would always have an introduction to whatever book you wrote, whether it was about physics or biology, about how Marx and Lenin and Engels had foreseen this all, and it was all part of dialectical materialism. And, you know, we're just adding a little bit here, but it was all foreseen by our great leaders. And so that's what they have to do now with climate change and CO2. The honest ones, I think, know it's bullshit, but you know, they won't speak up.
But don't you think that's a threat to science? So let me ask you first, those friends of yours or those colleagues that were supporting you either overtly or in private, in your views regarding the strange direction that the climate sciences were taking.
Yeah.
Did they end up being okay, or did some of them experience pushback or hardships or exclusion, or did you guys kind of like
Well, you know, there've been a number of very distinguished climate scientists who have finally become so fed up they've come out against it. You know, one of the most noted is Judith Curry down at Georgia Tech, although they drove her out of Georgia Tech, so she has her private company now. But Judith was a card-carrying climate alarmist. She was working on hurricane, frequency at the time of Hurricane Katrina. And so just as Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, she came out with papers claiming that this was all due to increasing CO2. And so she was treated like royalty, you know. It was, as she said, I was treated like a rock star. But she had this problem that she had she couldn't lie, you know. That's a real difficulty, you know, in some fields. And so then she saw the ClimateGate emails when she finally realized how much dishonesty there was in this field. And she started speaking out against her. And so it was like, you know, Judas Iscariot, you know, how dare you, you know, betray the sacred cause? And so they went after her with every weapon they had, smearing her, you know, vilifying her, running her out of her university job. So that's an example of what happens to you. She's a very strong person. Not many people would be willing to do that, you know. Most people look at that and they decide, well, I'm going to keep my mouth shut until retirement. Maybe I'll say something after retirement. But it takes a really courageous person to back off if you're part of that community to begin with. People like myself, you know, I never was a climate scientist. I know a lot about climate because of my work in other fields, probably more than most climate scientists. But, you know, I was never part of that, so I didn't betray them. I never believed in it to begin with.
right?
And another recent example is Steve Koonin, you know, who
Right.
was Obama's Undersecretary of Energy. And Steve, I've known Steve for many, many years, and I remember he was quite taken with the first IPCC reports. It seemed like honest science, and but then as the years went by and they became more and more extreme, Steve began having second thoughts. And but again, for both Steve and me, we have not gotten the same amount of vituperation as Judith, because we were never part of the
Right.
of the movement to begin with, you know. So we didn't betray anyone really.
Someone turning dissident, of course, hurts most when this person used to be a paragon or a superstar of the movement. That, of course, is the greater offense. Whereas if you are only in the periphery or not genuinely part of the movement,
Yeah, that's right.
it hurts.
That's right. For example, in radical Islam, it's okay to be a kafir, you know, and be a benighted infidel. But if you have accepted Islam and you defect, if you're an apostate, you're to be killed, right? And
Right.
so it's very similar to that. Not all Islam is like that, but you know, there is a branch that is very similar to that.
Right. But
Uh,
wouldn't you agree with my notion if I said, like, we see these fields, for example, journalism, for example, the arts, for example, academia in a wider sense, but then there is science. And of course, science is the one field of expertise or the one methodology that has a methodology to pursue objective truth to a full or to a extent. And I have this sense that when these scientific fields get sabotaged by the same, let's say, communistic or secular religious collective psychotic thinking as we discussed in the Salem witch trials, or in Nazi Germany, or in Bolshevism, which are all, of course, similar examples. But when science get attacked, the sciences get attacked, and when they erode, when people are being made impossible to pursue real scientific inquiry, which of course is the nature of scientific inquiry, to oppose a certain status quo, to provide new evidence, or to find out that a certain direction that has been believed to be the right direction is now been proven false, or is based on nonsense. Don't you think that is a very dangerous thing, that scientists are being witch hunted within their fields for making factual notions about subjects, whether it's climate or other disciplines?
Yes, of course, it's dangerous and it's very bad, and I hope will stop soon before it causes too much more damage to scientific fields. But it's happened in the past. You know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and in Britain and in the United States, there was this eugenics movement, which was just completely phony. But nevertheless, everyone seemed to believe it, claimed to believe it. And so there was all of these so-called scientists who were able to prove that the good old Anglo-Saxon race was the master race in the world. And, there were all these low IQ Italians and, Jews and Chinamen, it was complete nonsense. It was lies from top to bottom, and yet everybody believed it. The presidents of Harvard and Princeton and Stanford were big eugenicists, and little Midwestern towns had eugenic societies where ladies would come together every Thursday and wring their hands about the destruction of the gene pool. And so it's very hard to stop these things once they get going. And climate's that way too, because there's a certain virtue in, saving the planet, So when you question, does the planet really need to be saved? That's like questioning your religious belief. Of course it needs to be saved. All my friends think it needs to be saved. How dare you question this,
Right, right.
So the moment these things get into the popular consciousness and acquire a sort of a moral, aspect to them, like religion, that's when things are really dangerous, and that it can easily go very, very bad. In our case of eugenics, we were really saved by the Nazis because they took it over with a vengeance. They were very grateful for all of the prior work done in England and America. But then they took it to the extreme, nobody can do things more thoroughly than Germans. And so that discredited it and brought it down.
It showed itself. It showed
Yeah,
itself in the lab as being barbarous.
That's right. And that may happen with climate, because it almost happened in Sri Lanka, where because of the crazed policies of environmentalists there, they banned the use of nitrogen fertilizer. We were talking about nitrogen in Holland, and they banned the use of fossil fuels and pesticides, and it was a disaster. Prices of food went up. People couldn't feed their families. There were riots in the streets, and they finally stormed the presidential palace, and the president just barely escaped hanging by being evacuated by helicopter. And so that may be required to bring the climate craze to an end. So perhaps some unfortunate country, Germany perhaps, maybe the state of California, will do everything that's demanded, and the results will be just like Sri Lanka. And it will be big enough that other people will notice and realize, we should stop before we do the same thing.
Right. Yeah, you were talking earlier about in the Soviet Union how every theory or every new technological endeavor had to be introduced with this Marxist-Leninist kind of
Yeah,
introduction note, and everyone had to clap. for 20 minutes in order not to get shot by Stalin afterward. No, I'm joking. But there is this phenomenon they call, I believe, from Lysenko. There was this one agriculturalist within the Soviet Union called Lysenko, and it's called Lysenkoism, which is, I believe, the notion of implementing like egalitarianism, so Marxist egalitarianism within the science of agriculture and botany, which was directly responsible, or in part responsible, for the Holodomor, which killed, of course, 6 million Ukrainians and 3 million Volga Russians. I'm just very curious, how could we cure, for example, Harvard or Princeton or all Western universities in general from the entrance of ideology, activism, and religion into what should be the academic or scientific islands of reason?
Well, Lysenko, let's talk about him for a minute, and then we'll talk about universities. He was a agricultural extension agent. He wasn't very well educated. I think he could read and write, but just barely.
Right.
He was Ukrainian, and he developed these crazy ideas called Manchurian biology, which basically said that you could inherit acquired characteristics, and he said that all of the Mendelian genetics was wrong, that hybrid corn was wrong, it was all a capitalist plot, and so we'll do it the good old Slavic Russian way. And of course, it was all nonsense. It was like the witch trials, and I don't think you can accuse himself so much for the Holodomor, because he was still a young man and hadn't done most of his damage when that happened. But I'm sure, didn't do anything to help.
Right.
He was, the only reason he was successful was that the political powers supported him. So he was supported by Stalin, and he was supported later by Khrushchev. People were hoping when Stalin died, that would be the end of Lysenko, but Khrushchev picked him up. And so when Khrushchev was finally deposed in the propaganda next day in Pravda, one of the accusations against Khrushchev was he had supported this charlatan Lysenko. You know, Lysenko had been a hero of the Soviet Union the previous day, but after Khrushchev went down, he was a charlatan, which is what he was all the time. So, you know, it was driven not by the scientists, but by the politicization. And you know, one of my heroes in Russia was Andrei Sakharov, who was a physicist, and he first, you know, came to attention by inventing the hydrogen bomb, you know, quite independently of Teller. Teller admits that, you know, and so this was considered very important in the Soviet Union. It was. It gave them a sense of security that they needed, and but Sakharov was an honest man. He was like Judith Curry; he couldn't tell a lie, and
Right.
so he recognized that Lysenkoism was nonsense. And so I've forgotten the year, I think it was around 1948 or a little bit later, Lysenko had decided he was going to pack the Russian Academy of Sciences with his toadies, you know, these completely incompetent people, you know, who were his acolytes. And this had to be voted on by the other members of the academy, by chemists, by physicists, by geologists, and everyone knew that Lysenko was supported by Stalin. And I guess this was a little bit later. This was during the Khrushchev era. I'm not a good historian, but the flavor will be correct, and you can check the details.
Yeah.
So anyway, Sakharov got up and he said, "This is complete nonsense." He gave a public speech. You know, these people are charlatans. You know, it's an embarrassment. We look like fools to everyone else in the world, you know, and we're not fools. We've got all these distinguished real scientists here. And so it was voted down. And this was unheard of. This was the Khrushchev era. Yeah, it wasn't during Stalin. And so Khrushchev was just furious. And he said, well, I'm going to abolish the Academy of Sciences.
Wow.
And so that was, I think, June or July or something like that. But he was eager to take his vacation. And so it required a certain amount of bureaucratic paperwork and everything to abolish the Academy of Sciences. So he said, I'll do it after I return from my vacation. And so while Khrushchev was on his vacation, there was this palace coup that deposed him. But had he not been deposed, he would have abolished the Academy of Sciences. And, you know, you have to admire the Russians because their academies of sciences showed real courage. It's a lot more than the Royal Society or the US Academy of Sciences have done with climate. You know, they've been hijacked by the climate thugs, just as Lysenko tried to do with the Russian Academy. So our academies have let themselves be hijacked. The Russian Academy refused to be hijacked. And they've been pretty good on climate too. So I have a lot of respect for scientists in Russia. Now,
Well,
you say universities, you're talking, what can we do about Princeton and Harvard? I think the tide is beginning to turn. For example, Harvard refused to grant degrees to some of the most extreme protesters. I think there were 13 or something of them. And we didn't have the same problems at Princeton. You know, we're lucky because we're not in a metropolitan area. And so you don't get as much bang for your buck with a demonstration here because CBS News isn't here. And, you know, CNN, they don't have news people. And so you get more bang for your buck at Columbia or at Harvard.
right.
And so I believe that this problem will solve itself. You know, I'm hoping it will. As I say, in the science ghettos, you don't really get the full brunt of it, although we do get it through for example, in engineering and some areas of science have been badly damaged by the climate cult. And it'll take them a long time to dig out of that because you give people tenure, you know,
Right.
for climate this and that, and they're there for life unless they do something really terrible that's hard to get rid of them. And so it's a waste of scarce, you know, academic positions that could have gone to more talented people.
Don't you think? Yeah, I have the same sense. I have the sense in the world that there is this. We have reached peak woke, so to speak. We have reached the full swing of the pendulum. We have had this insanity for a couple of years, this stasis at the end of the swing, and now we are feeling the first tendency of the pendulum to swing back, which of course has its own dangers, of course, of going into reactionary fascism or whatever, or Christian nationalism, you name it. But I do think, even though I have this same emotional desire to think that things are going to solve itself, to feel the first rays of light through the clouds, this first bit of optimism to be felt, I do also think, in a realistic sense, that we have a huge proportion of two entire generations having been completely brainwashed with the ideology religiously, failed to learn to think critically, actually have been taught to think emotionally, to prefer the emotional or the so-called ideological or what they consider ethical mores, to have it triumph over their own reason. So what do we do with that? What do we do with this giant university population? Um, I think my heart is a little bit more optimistic than my mind is, or my reason is at the moment. What do you
Well,
think?
I think there's a good chance that in spite of the brainwashing, that the pendulum will swing. You know, if you look back in history, there are these religious movements. You know, I'm half Scottish, so in my country in Scotland, we had the Solemn League and Covenant, and it was fanatics. You know, there was some good to it, but it was hijacked by just complete fanatics. And
Were they
They
Calvinists
brainwashed.
or
Huh?
were they
They're
Protestants?
Protestants, but extreme Protestants, really.
Yeah, I'm from Calvinist Holland, so I know.
Okay, well, you would understand what I'm saying. And,
Yes.
it just, after a generation or two, even though they had brainwashed all the kids, the people just got fed up with it and they stopped paying any attention to it. If you read, for example, the poetry of Robert Burns, he makes fun of them and he could get away with it. It was safe to do that by the time that he wrote his poetry. The English had the same experience, the English Puritans were really pretty hard to live with. And of course, the extreme Catholics were just the same. So any religion, that has extremists is bad news. And eventually they turn off everyone. People just stop paying any attention to them. But it sometimes takes 2 or 3 generations before that happens. So we're dealing with a sort of secular religion with climate, and it's heavily funded. But so were these previous incidents. So for that reason, the fact that they've worked their way out of it, humanity has worked its way out of similar things in the past. I think we'll work our way out of this one too.
Right. Well, of course, we started off with the United States with its Second Amendment and its Constitution and its, let's call it esprit, its libertarian esprit of all those people who were fed up with feudal and overpopulated Europe and wanted to experience, of course, a selective kind of population. Some selection and some emotion has been transported across the Atlantic. But of course, I think rightfully so, the United States are lauded for their constitution and for their political makeup. They're not the only democracy in the world. They're not the only democracy with a sound constitution that is relatively old. But of course, the structure of the American Constitution and its formulation are unique. And they do tend to offer some protection against tyranny, ideology, and subversion, right?
That's correct.
As do constitutions in general. Well, if we take that example, we project it onto, for example, the sciences or academia and that educational world, where a certain degree of subsidizing is inevitable because these things cannot be funded in almost any other way than through some sort of collective means. Are there checks and balances that we could build into higher education to prevent in the moment, in the now, but also in the foreseeable future, that entire generations will have to be sacrificed on the altar of Moloch of like insanity? Are there checks and balances to be made that prevent ideology from usurping the sciences? For example, I had a previous podcast like a year ago with two Dutch scientists, respectively from the University of Amsterdam and the University of Utrecht. We had a discussion about ideology and activism in the sciences because, of course, they are part of humanity, so they did have a lot of experience with clashes with woke activism and the discourse that they were teaching. And I asked them this question, like, how is it possible that within a university, under the same roof, under the same umbrella, under the same status of the university, there is a range of disciplines, quite old disciplines, biology, even evolutionary biology, neurology, medicine, anatomy, and all disciplines and sub-disciplines related to those fields that have been claiming for centuries and in exponential sense proven their claim that there are, in fact, evolutionary reasons, for example, why we are a dimorphic species that has females and males, and why that is so, and that there are not only physical, but a whole range of facets in which human males and human females do differ. Then, on the other side, since the 70s, so since the postmodernists and Foucault and feminism and the whole sociological departments of all universities in France and the United States and later Canada and Europe became taken over by this mixture of French postmodernist thought, identitary Marxist thought out of Germany, and the feminist thought out of New York and Chicago, so to speak. There came this new blend of disciplines that claims the exact opposite of that other range of disciplines. And they say, no, gender is a social construct. And we all know the lingo, right? I'm not even going to beef that inconsistency out right here, but just the question I had for those guys was, how can it be? How can a university function when it claims to be a scientific and academic institution that operates on the basis of truth inquiry and scientific methodology, and it allows for the existence of disciplines that have completely incompatible views about the fundamentals of existence and claim them both as scientific, both under the banner of scientific discipline? Isn't the check or the balance that we're looking for the scrutiny of disciplines per se? You mentioned when we were talking about the history of these ideological manifestations, for example, within the client sciences, and how during your time they radicalized, and you called them, for example, parasites. And I agree with you. I think there are grifters in this world, and there are idiots in this world who get too much power by virtue of some kind of bureaucracy or some wave of ideology that they serve like a server. But for a university to boast disciplines that have like warlike contradictory claims about reality, that would seem quite problematic to me. Could you shoot on that for me? Like,
Well, universities are, pride themselves in letting faculty co-opt themselves. So when you hire a new physicist, he's not hired by the president of the university. He's hired by the other faculty in the physics department, or same for other departments. And so that decision is affected by many factors. First, how good is the person? That's important. Nowadays, there's lots and lots of pressure for diversity. So, if you want a job in Princeton physics department, if you're good and if you happen to be female or some other minority, that is a real plus. You'll get a job. Other things being equal. And the other thing that affects it is funding. So, for example, if there's lots of funding for transgender studies from Washington, you think, well, if I hire this new young professor who's an expert on transgender, he'll bring in $3 or $4 million. The university will get a good half of that as overhead, and what's not to like about that? So I think one thing that would cure this would be to cut the funding sources.
right.
And that's something that could be done, for example, by Congress and or by the executive branch. And if you cut the source of money, then these bizarre fields will stop growing. They.
And how would you prevent in the future from these, like the cancer growth of these fictitious scientific fields from popping up into existence and expanding? So that is the thing what I'm looking for. Like, how can it be? For example, of course, from women's studies to gender studies to transgender studies, you can see the progression. But if we were to think up like spaghetti monster studies, if the University of Harvard or Arkansas would just start a department of spaghetti monster studies, we could all recognize immediately,
Yeah.
well, is that really a scientific field of study we need to inquire and fund? But how do we build in this scrutiny, like within a scientific field? For example, in physics, I'm one of those guys who's really bad at math and physics, but within such a field, you can easily, within the methodology of the science, scrutinize theories and phenomena to get to a certain truth. But how do you scrutinize, how do you methodologize a discipline itself for being worthwhile or even real? Spaghetti monster studies, so to speak. How do we scrutinize spaghetti monster studies?
Well, I think there's some advantage to having crazy things advanced because 99% of them are wrong, but 1% might be very important. And so if we can arrange universities to try out crazy things and just not let them grow too much and let them die out a natural death later if it turns out they're not that 1% that really is important. That's okay to do in a university. It doesn't cost very much, and you get a chance to look at ideas and without harming the great bulk of society. So I think universities should be places where you experiment.
Mm.
Another point I'd like to make is that one thing that would help diversity is diversity of funding. I mentioned how important funding is. And so some people say, United States should have a Department of Science. And I've always said, boy, I can't think of a dumber idea. A Department of Science, that means 1-point failure. That means that you'll get someone in control who will be completely wrong about 2 or 3 things, and it will be impossible to fix it because you've got this monolithic funding department. So I think one of the big advantages of the United States system for many years was that we had many sources of funding even from the government, not just private individuals. So you could get funding from the Office of Naval Research or from the, National Science Foundation or from my department, Department of Energy, and often these funders were competing with each other, and if you didn't get funding from, Department of Energy, you could go to the Naval Research Office where the director didn't much like the director of the Department of Energy, and he would fund you, and you try it out. And so I think diversity of sources is very important. And, you can engineer that, you don't have to let it happen spontaneously. You can just insist that it happen. It's why we have 2 houses of parliament, because it's the same basic idea.
Right. A separation of dependencies as much as a separation of powers, which of course is almost the same.
Yeah.
And do you see in your experience that climate science field then has less of a pluriformity of sources than, for example, universities or other scientific departments, or is it the same thing? Because we've of course observed earlier, or the documentary you appeared in earlier describes how this becomes a self-sustaining model. So how scientists have to apply for fundings with theories that reaffirm the climate narrative, whereby that grows, and so the power manifestation of that narrative or field reinforces itself. Is there any relation between that phenomenon and the way it's sourced in funding?
Well, for many years, climate research was helped by this diversity of funding. So some really good work, for example, was done by Nicholas Scaffetta, Italian who was at Duke at the time, funded by the Army Research Office, which was nearby, and he had friends there. And it would not have been funded without that tie and without that diversity of funding. But it's gotten harder because each new administration has embraced climate alarmism. The Republicans in many ways are just as bad as the Democrats. So it's a bipartisan, just as it is in, say, Great Britain, where both Labour and the Tories support climate craziness. I think to cure this, since it's gotten this sort of religious tone, we will have to have one of these disasters happen, where some relatively large political entity, a state or a country collapses because of pushing climate policies too far. And then it'll all it's a house of cards, it'll fall down at that point.
That is a realistic but also a cynical reality. So we have to go Sri Lanka or Lysenko's
Yeah,
experiment has to be executed.
yeah, we probably do. Probably do.
Sounds quite dangerous to me.
Yeah. Well, humans are very adaptable. They'll live through it.
Yes.
You know, Kant got it right, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made.
Right, right. Well, I think we've reached a beautiful end of our chat here.
Okay, well, thanks very much, and keep up your good work. And,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks for your hospitality and good humor. And we'll ride out this climate storm until humanity adapts itself.
Okay, come see me at Princeton someday.
Well, thank you.
Okay,
Will.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.